Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to Course 3A of the Monique and Roland Weil People's Academy of International Law. I am Marjorie Cohn, Dean of the People's Academy and a member of the Bureau of the International Association of Democratic Lawyers. Our topic for today is the United Nations main subsidiary organs and specialized agencies. Our faculty for this seminar includes Hilal Elver, Susan Akram, and Michael Link. Each of them will speak for about 40 minutes. Then they will comment on each other's presentations, followed by Q&A with all of you. We have French, Spanish, and English translation. Please put your questions in the Q&A box for our discussion following the presentations. In the next few days, we will post the faculty presentations in English, French, and Spanish on our website, peoplesacademy.net. Hilal Elver is a professor of international law, specializing in human rights and international environmental law. She is co-director of the Climate Change, Democracy, and Human Security Project at the University of California, Santa Barbara. From 2014 to 2020, Hilal served as the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food. She is currently a member of the steering committee of the high-level panel of experts of the UN World Committee on Food Security and a member of the Scientific Advisory Committee of the UN Food Systems Hub. Hilal taught and maintained several affiliations with academic institutions worldwide. Her select publications, UN reports, and articles are featured on her website, hilalelver.org. Professor Elver will discuss the function of the Human Rights Council and the role of the special rapporteurs, as well as the crime of starvation, famine, and food security. Susan Akram is a graduate of the University of Michigan, Georgetown University School of Law, Oxford University, New College, and the Institut International des Droits de l'Homme. She directs Boston University Law School's International Human Rights Clinic, in which she supervises students engaged in international advocacy in domestic, international, regional, and UN fora. Susan teaches or has taught courses in international human rights, refugee and migration law, U.S. immigration law, and Palestinian refugees under international law. She has taught at the American University in Cairo, Egypt, Al-Quds and Birzeit Universities in Palestine, the Oxford University Refugee Studies Center, and the University of Murcia in Spain. She is a double Fulbright Senior Scholar Award recipient to Palestine from 1999 to 2000 and Spain from 2021 to 2022. Her research and publications focus on immigration, asylum, refugees, forced migration, and human and civil rights issues, with an emphasis on the Middle East, the Arab, and Muslim world. Professor Akram will discuss UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, and the Human Rights Council, with a focus on Palestine and other Palestinian and other refugees. Michael Link was a member of the Faculty of Law, Western University, London, Ontario, Canada, between 1999 and his retirement in 2022, where he taught courses in labor, human rights, disability, constitutional and administrative law. He served as Associate Dean of the faculty between 2008 and 2011 and became Professor Emeritus in 2023. Michael serves as a labor arbitrator and mediator and is presently an arbitrator with the Ontario Grievance Settlement Board. The co-author of Trade Union Law in Canada, published by Carswell, and Employment Law in Canada, 5th edition, by LexisNexis. He has published widely on Canadian labor law and human rights law. In May 2016, the UN Human Rights Council unanimously selected Michael for a 6-year term as the 77th Special Rapporteur for the human rights situation in the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967. In that capacity, he delivered regular reports to the UN General Assembly and the Human Rights Council on human rights trends in the occupied Palestinian territory. He has written about his UN experiences in a 2022 book co-authored with Richard Falk and John Dugard, 2 of his predecessors as UN Special Rapporteurs in Palestine. It is titled Protecting Human Rights in Occupied Palestine, Working Through the United Nations, published by Clarity Press. Professor Link will discuss the role of UNICEF in Palestine and his work as the Special Rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territory. So we'll start with Hilal Elvert. Hilal?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction, Marjorie, and organizing this classroom about 3 of us, which is, I'm very happy to be with them. So in my talk, as you presented, I'm going to talk shortly about the Human Rights Council and the role of the special rapporteurs from my experience, based on my experiences. And then I will talk a little bit about the human rights system in the United Nations, the differences between civil and political rights and economic and social rights. So then I will go a kind of like a case study. What's happening right now in our time is off right now when we are talking starvation and famine in Gaza and how to deal with this situation in Gaza in general. So if I start first, the Human Rights Council is one of the important bodies of the United Nations dealing with the human rights issues, basically promoting and protecting and basically monitoring the human rights system around the world from the international law point of view. So it's first established as a United Nations Commission on Human Rights, and then I think in 2006 it became a Human Rights Council. General Assembly decision made from the Commission to the Council. The Human Rights Council is structurally there is a High Commissioner of the Human Rights and the member states and the special procedures, which we are basically dealing with the special procedures in this talk. There are 47 members, then also selected by the General Assembly, which means not all UN members are part of the Human Rights Council. It's selected and it's I'm not sure. I think every 3 years, maybe 3 times. I don't know these details, but this is very clearly, if you go to the website, you really find out all the. So if we look at what is the impact of the Human Rights Council or basically UN human rights system, the impact may be from the comparative manner, like the Human Rights, Security Council is very, very limited, Human Rights Council. Credibility a little bit even eroded when it fails to address the grave human rights situation violation because of the political reasons. So it's a legally a kind of promotion and the protection, but at the same time, enforcement mechanism is rather not very strong. They have the decisions are not legally binding, but also there are important role among the civil society, among the public opinion. So that's a very complicated way of dealing with the Human Rights Council. So what are the instruments? What the Human Rights Councils would work that helps the human rights protection and promotion and also implementation? There are specific ways of doing this. One of them is Universal Periodic Review, what we call UPR. Every countries in member states are subject to universal periodic review. And when they do the review session, not only governments, but also NGOs, they give report about especially what's happening in specific countries, which is a very important thing because no country in the world would like to be exposed in a negative manner. So the countries are trying to do their best to be represented in a fairly. So this is the one important mechanism. The other important mechanism is a kind of individual complaint mechanism, which is not much well known maybe, but any individual or any NGOs or any group of people can apply to the Human Rights Council to ask to request investigation about what is going on in their country. Then the Human Rights Council first do the investigation in a kind of not open to public manner, and then they write to the countries that they accused about the human rights violations, and the countries has to respond in a particular time period. And this time period, again, Human Rights Council does not expose anything, but during the time period that there was no answer or not kind of satisfactory answer, then that will be exposed publicly. So that's important kind of complaint mechanism. If you go to the Human Rights Council website, you'll see how to apply, what is the rules and principles and procedures. It's very clear, and it is there. The special procedures are very important also because they are the monitoring bodies. Even though, as we said, not legally binding monitoring system, but is a very important system to expose the human rights issues around the world. Special procedures has either treaty bodies and the special rapporteurship. So the difference is special rapporteurs are, I think, as far as I remember, which they are independent experts, 46 thematic special rapporteurs right now under the Geneva Human Rights Council. Each human rights have their own independent experts, and also 14 country mandates. For instance, Michael Ling is one of the country mandate special rapporteur. I was, as a right to food, is the independent expert on the thematic issues that could be right to the water, environment, housing, freedom of speech, torture, many, all kind of specific human rights system is represented, not actually represented, but monitored by the independent experts. So how do we monitor the specific human rights violations or promoting, sometimes not only violation, but also they basically suggest us we have to bring also good practices. So countries love very much the good practices rather than monitoring. They don't like the language of the monitoring. And they always, we have the every year meetings with the member states, with the special rapporteurs. They try to explain why you are always criticizing. Maybe you should show what good practices that we have been doing. It's a good thing, of course, but unfortunately very rare and also subject to a little bit of manipulation. So that's we have to be very careful. And also independent expert has to be really, really independent. They have to act regardless from which country they are coming from, and they shouldn't have any kind of conflict of interest with the connected with the governments or connected with the some kind of institutions and civil servants. That kind of an important way of they are investigating when they pick the independent experts. So it used to be more political to pick the special rapporteurs, who will be the special rapporteurs, because it's an international global selection, supposedly based on expertise, but sometimes it doesn't go that way. So that's why it very much depends on who is the selection committee, which is 3 to 5 ambassadors, member of the council. So sometimes they use their own personal interest or they use their own geopolitical interest. So then the decisions are not always fair. So that's a very important issue. When they don't do, of course, they lose their legitimacy. It has to be absolutely independent from all kind of geopolitical interests, all kind of countries' special national interests, and the special rapporteur should be extremely objective, whatever the countries is they are investigating. So how do we investigate countries? Every special rapporteur should generally they do twice countries in a year mission trip. So we are 6 years, 3 years, 3 years, 6 years period. And every year we go to 2 countries. And altogether 11 and 12 countries that we are doing. And at the end of the mission trips, basically 10 days, 15 days with the committee, not very committee, actually special rapporteurs goes with their assistants that Human Rights Council or Office of the High Commissioners give as a kind of advisor or helper or assistant. And if we do specific investigation in the country from the government, civil society, all sometimes it's most importantly going to the villages, going to the houses and knock the door, trying to get in and investigate and talk with the ordinary people. So that's the only way we have to go to the ground to understand what is happening rather than law books in the library. That's extremely important. Or the laws that parliamentarians issued, it's in the constitution, but they never be implemented. So that's an extremely, I believe, the mission trips is the most important procedure in for the special rapporteurs. Special rapporteurs also twice a year, one in Geneva, Human Rights Council, the other one is United Nations General Assembly. They should, they also present thematic reports. So 2 mission reports and 2 thematic reports. thematic reports depending on what kind of issues in this position is important. So for instance, when I was a special rapporteur, I was trying to understand, basically, of course, we know what is going on, but there's some issues become more important than others. For instance, I did write something about the women's role in the food system one year. The other year, I did write about the conflict situation and the food security, which I sent this report for you, kind of like an example what we have been doing. So we are completely independent. We can pick the countries independently. We can pick the thematic reports independently. These are very important, being an independent. So, and then what happens when we bring this discussion in the Human Rights Council and the New York, all the countries are listening and they are giving their comments, sometimes serious criticism. Also, NGOs in Geneva have a right to talk about it, but not in the General Assembly, as far as I know. So many of the special rapporteurs get serious criticism about. If you don't get criticism, this means you're not doing your job. So that's a kind of way of dealing with how special rapporteurs could be actively promoting human rights and actively going against the violations, or not very kind of diplomatically not touching the dark parts of the violation. So it's all about who is the special rapporteur, what kind of work they are doing. Most of the special rapporteurs are doing pretty good job, but this most of the is an important sentence. So that's the kind of the hard, very difficult position. But because we are not a civil servant of the United Nations, this is the also explaining an important way. Because we are not civil servants, we are free, we don't have a salary. It's a completely honorary position. Human Rights Council only pays our expenses when we go to the missions and when we go to the report presentations. So this comes to budget issues. The budget issues also very much relevant to how independent we are. Human Rights Council's budget is extremely limited, very, very limited. Only 4.3% of the entire UN budget dedicated to Human Rights Council. This means Human Rights Council was not established from the day first, really actively monitoring human rights. So because if you think about it, 4.3% contribution, UN General Assembly in New York Library has a more budget. So that's, you have to think about it, why it is like that, very small. And there's also earmark contributions, which is earmark contributions becomes problematic because countries basically voluntary contributions doing, some of them earmark, some of them non-earmark. Non-earmark is maybe more objective. Developed countries basically are doing this kind of contributions, but earmark contributions make an important discrimination among the special rapporteurship, because some special rapporteurs get a lot of attention, for instance, torture, freedom of speech, or some country mandates. They get a lot of money from the government, but some other special rapporteurs don't get. When they get the money, they hire more experts, they have more trips, and they publish their reports and a kind of fancy pamphlets, and they organize expert meetings. So it's a very important issue dealing with the budget. Michael, I'm sure, will talk about it. Of course, Palestinian case, special rapporteur is very special, nothing like ours. For instance, right to food special rapporteur before me, he was from the European Union member countries. He got a significant amount of budget help. But when I become special rapporteur from Turkey, they're not from the European Union, and United States doesn't accept economic and social rights anyway. We didn't get anything. So that's the kind of difference how budget is affecting special rapporteurs' kind of visibility. So when we come back again, impact, public, as I said, public opinion, civil society, objective evaluation, monitoring is very, very important. We are not only dealing with the member states. Actually, when we deal with member states, we will have a very limited impact, but it's a public opinion is very important. So especially in relation to Gaza, you will see how important special rapporteurs acted and made an important changes in among the public opinion. So when we come right now, right to food and economic and social rights and civil and political rights, we have to deal with it, this distinction. Why there is this distinction? Why distinction affected the whole human rights system? The whole important thing is about basically challenges of the human rights. All the system is good, established quite well, rather not very powerfully, but there are some challenges. The most important challenge is weakness of human rights institution in the domestic level. Even in international level, there is the Human Rights Council, there is the procedure, but a lack of monitoring power and also member states lack of interest making much stronger human rights institution. It's very difficult to do the enforcement mechanism properly. Another issue is there are silos among the United Nations bodies. You know, we talk about the Human Rights Council, we talk about the UNICEF, or World Health Organization, which I work very closely, and Rome institutions in relation to food system. When we talk Rome institution, Rome-based institution, rather unfamiliar concept, because three important institutions under the UN bodies are situated in Rome. So my job as a special rapporteur on right to food was very much connected with Rome. I was going to Rome more often than the Geneva. So because FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, is in Rome, and World Food Program, which is basically humanitarian aid, food aid in the conflict and the disaster areas. World Food Program is in Rome, and also IFAD is a kind of credit help for the developing countries in relation to agriculture and food system. So I had very close connection with these institutions than the Geneva with my fellow special rapporteurs. That's a little bit unusual, but maybe other special rapporteurs have their UN organizations that they were connected with the other parts of the UN, which is very important. If we break the silos, the United Nations will work much better. We don't have to repeat what they are doing in Rome, but we don't know in Geneva, or what we are doing in Geneva. Basically, Rome doesn't know anything about it. So bringing the food security from the perspective of human rights was really challenging. When I was part of the food and FAO meeting, or global international food security committee, I am the member as a special rapporteur. Any special rapporteur goes there, will be a position there. Now the current special rapporteur is doing this job. You get some kind of resistance there. What they say, well, you are not in Geneva anymore. You are in Rome. We are not doing human rights. We are doing food security. This is not the way to talk about the right to food or human rights. You have to make sure right to food is part of their mandate. Food and Agriculture Organization has a constitution that established in 1945. Right to food is one of the principles. You have to keep telling them. The countries, especially, not very sympathetic to the human rights issues, especially in this case, some countries love the economic and social rights. The other countries like civil and political rights. United States never accepted economic and social rights as a real human rights. So because of that, we are challenging every time when we bring our reports or when we discuss in the General Assembly or anywhere, United States government's representatives put his hand or her hand up and says, well, economic and social rights is not real rights. We don't accept that. That's a kind of very uphill problem for my and for any other economic social rights special rapporteurs. So there is a big difference in the implementation. There is also a big difference in the monitoring system. For instance, civil and political rights has a monitoring protocol very early, but economic and social rights monitoring protocol came 2013, and not many countries ratified, and we don't have too much case on that. So you have to understand how there is a discrimination against economic and social rights than the civil and political rights. There are several reasons of that. The one important reason is Cold War ideology. Cold War ideology is West and East, the world divided, and the US and the Soviet Republic, they have their own friends, and then they had the different ideology about the economic and social rights and the civil and political rights. This system still is going on, rather not very clearly, but that's one thing. And then still this big gap, because of role of United States, it's not going to be filled. And also all the countries, not only US, not only Russia, Russians also don't like very much. The weak political domestic system is very, very problematic. When you have a weak political will, this also affects NGOs. When we do our mission in the specific countries, if the country is democratic, if the countries have a strong human rights system, they have a very good NGOs. If they have a very good NGOs, your work is so easy. They do the work for you. But if you don't have a good human rights organizations, NGOs, and the government is kind of become a police what you are doing in the mission. It's a very, very difficult to really make the objective reports. But because as I said before, no countries would like to be criticized among other countries, member states. When you criticize very simple manner, they try to be dismiss, and it's a hard way. Of course, economic and social rights special rapporteurs may be less criticized, but the right to food is one of the special rapporteurs that criticize very strongly. So one saying all these things, let's go right now very briefly, hopefully briefly, the Gaza situation, because Gaza situation is completely and squarely under the right to food mandate, besides the other special rapporteurs mandate, because there are a bunch of human rights violation is going on. So we have to share the screen right now. Let me try to do. Can you make me a screen share, please? Can you see right now?
Yes, we can see the
Okay.
slides, Hilal.
So
Yeah.
what I try to explain, now I will give the example what is going on in Gaza, because now there are plenty of crimes in Gaza is happening. So there are plenty of human rights violations and violations of international humanitarian law. So we have Geneva Convention, all the international humanitarian law principles are written there, and the human rights laws, which is Universal Declaration of the Human Rights, and then two covenants, civil and political rights, and the economic, social, and cultural rights. And all these rights are right now violated severely. Because it is severely, it's subject of the international criminal law, which is ICC, Rome Statute. So that is the kind of our structure, how we look at the Gaza situation. So let's look at the Gaza map. I think I should make it here. Can you see the map clearly here? The map is, maybe you all know, maybe you don't know. This is the very tiny parts of Israel, occupied since 1967 and sealed since 2005 by the Israelis, and total besieged since 2007. So all this, as you see, the orange one is the urban areas, in northern Gaza, Gaza City. It's terrible situation right now because they took the people from north to south. Khan Yunis is an important city, and the city of Rafah. So these are the major things are happening right now. So since October 7, my voice is coming, right? Everything is okay? Hello?
Yes, Hilal, we can hear you and we can see the slides. Thank you.
Okay, because I didn't hear anything. I said, oh, what am I doing?
Yes.
Okay.
Fine.
Since October 7, Israel is waging war on civilians in occupied territories where over 50% of population are children. So there is, as we know, a complete kind of punishment of the entire Gazans. Nothing, no differentiation, nothing. Although they talk about the war against Hamas, it's war against Gazan people, or we don't talk about the West Bank, that's also a problem. So wounding and maiming, especially among children, is unbelievably high. In no other conflict in the world, too many children lost their arms and legs. It's, I think 3 months ago, as of November or December, there was 1,000 children lost their or arms or legs, compared to Ukraine war, which is 2 years, since 2 years, only 35 cases. That's, you can understand the severity of the Gaza. Targeting journalists, also to put together last 50 years of the conflict, is still less than what happened in Gaza. And targeting health workers and hospitals, it's unheard. 470 medical and health workers have been killed in Gaza. To put together again, all the conflicts is more in Gaza. Mass displacement and forced relocation. More than 80% of the Gazans went from north to south, south to north, from east to west. They were pushed to go safe place, which there is no safe place in. Secretary General was said that there is no safe even one point in Gaza. So a crime of domicide. Now the special rapporteur of housing made a kind of report on that, because destroying homes and residential areas is unheard in any kind of conflict again. Basically, northern Gaza, 70% of, you see in the map, in middle, 45%, and Khan Yunis, 53%, and Rafah, 30% of private houses, public houses, all demolished. And then extrajudicial execution is going on, especially recently. Last week, every media talks about some kind of AI surveillance program, what they call Lavender, or the Where is the Daddy, to strike computer-generated targets in their homes. And they use dump bombs because they're cheaper. When they're cheaper, they destroy entire building only for one person, which is not clear is part of Hamas or not, because a computer generates the profile. The profile cannot be corrected or cannot be always clear. So targeting religious and cultural sites, destroying universities, libraries, and archives, and I think more than 50 professors was killed. And that's also interesting, how they can really attack cultural life. And non-discriminating weapons, especially phosphorus, that's illegally used, they are reported on that, which is extremely problematic over civilians and the environment. Excessive use of force, we all know, but seeing the pictures makes really think about it. Cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatments is happening. Torture is happening. So all among these human rights violations, as I said before, all the human rights violations are together. We can't really make the differentiation between economic, social, cultural rights and the civil and political rights that you see in Gaza all together. So if I focus on the man-made famine and mass starvation, which is happening right now in Gaza, severe violation of the right to food, and it's a crime, it's a starvation crime. So starvation crime is not only about food, but also water. Especially Gaza children cannot access 90% of their normal water use. This is the UNICEF report. All these reports actually I use from the United Nations organization or very important NGOs like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Oxfam. They're all objective information. So the children basically are water providers. Barely drop of water to drink in Gaza. Less than 1 liter per day per person. According to World Health Organization, you have to have the most severe water insecurity is 15 liters per day. This is 1 liter. So there is a perfect storm right now because most of the Gazans lost their homes. They live in the tents or streets or demolished buildings. And the rainy season starts. They become a kind of hunger, lack of clean water, lack of sanitation. Combination is the death from the treatable diseases that make the starvation is even more severe. So, for instance, every 200 people, there's one toilet in these places, and every 6,000 people, one shower. This is unheard. I'm not sure it is true, but this is the reports what they say. So what happened? The Israelis not only blocked the food access, but also they destroyed the agricultural land. This is, you see, October in the left side, October 15, the green area is non-affected agricultural land. If you see January 6, the red completely damaged agricultural land, which is 49% of the land is affected. Greenhouses, all kind of farms. And then they go also the sea, from land to the sea, destruction of all resources, because lands are, sea are important food security for Gazans because the fishing. Of course, the Israelis know that 80% of the Gaza fishing sector destroyed, 98% is affected. So they can't use this anymore. And also very important things, the livestock, the animals were killed, destroyed, demolished. And 70% of meat and dairy producing livestock have been killed or prematurely slaughtered. Why is that? Maybe because indiscriminate kind of destruction, but at the same time, there's a deliberate destruction because they are important milk producing animals. And the milks are very important for children to avoid the malnutrition. So that's why FAO is trying to make this livestock restoring to stop the severe malnutrition. So, but Palestinians are very resilient. Most of the bakeries were completely demolished. There are few of them, but still they are working in the few of them. But now there is no flour, all kind of problems, as you know. So besides of the attack to people, attack the food system and the water system, agriculture, they basically attack to nature. So is ecocide a war crime? That has to be also discussed because the pollution of the soil, pollution of the water, destruction of the entire land does not allow the Palestinians will live in the post-war time. So what is the humanitarian aid, the most important thing, international humanitarian law principles? Unfortunately, in Gaza, this is a very most problematic part of the case, humanitarian catastrophe or humanities catastrophe. This United Nations Secretary of General Guterres raised this question. This is the humanities catastrophe, not the humanitarian. This means how possible humanitarian aid was attacked and the international community does not say anything about this. So the UNRWA's role, I think Susan will talk about this. The very important organization, kind of blood vessels of the life protecting situation in entire Palestine, and also, of course, the other refugees. But then, interestingly enough, when International Court of Justice made a decision about the plausibility of genocide, next day, Israelis come up with the accusation and they block UNRWA. And they block the money first, and then they block the going into the northern Gaza. So in 29th of February, I think, or March, I don't remember, there was a terrible massacres, what we call flour massacre. People ride into to get the flour from the humanitarian convoy, but the Israelis kill 112 people and injured more than 700. Then the United States said, oh, we're going to help. Okay, we're going to send the humanitarian aid from the air. It was absolutely dysfunctional, absolutely impossible, extremely costly way rather than going to land, and also killed some people because people jump into the water and they didn't know how to swim. The most recently, last week, there was a big time of problem because international NGO, World Central Kitchen, was bringing the food from Cyprus to the Gaza through the kind of flotilla type of things. And 3 times they attacked the 3 cars and they killed 7 humanitarian aid person. They all Europeans, Australians, and all except 1 Palestinians, made a huge impact in international community. Before there are hundreds of food aid people, but they were Palestinians, didn't really make so much big time news, but this become. So what we should go right now, what is famine? I'm not going to details for the famine because famine is imminent in the Gaza, we know that. But what I'm trying to show you, there is a important organization, community of UN organization, what we call IPC, Integrated Phase Food Insecurity Level. They calculate the food insecurity in the areas. So this is in Palestine, as you see, the phase 3, phase 4, and phase 5. These are the catastrophic, crisis, emergency, and catastrophic. If you see the last projected March, May, 1.1 million people are about to be in the famine. If you look at this 2 map, I'm showing this 2 map because in 2 months, the difference is incredible. That means it goes very fast, deep, fast, and complete of the Gaza society, which is very different than other conflict region. If you see it in the right side, Gaza Strip north is the under the series of the famine. The red is about to come. They are expecting July will be completely in the everywhere. So what happened from the international law perspective, important development happened. I think this part, the role of the International Court of Justice about the plausibility of genocide, I think Michael will talk about it, so I'm not going to detail, but I'm going to look at the international humanitarian law principles. That's an important thing because international humanitarian law really is the rules of war, how to how to act during the wartime to protect civilians. So there are three important principles. It has to be distinction, proportionality, and precaution. None of these three principles will be were implemented in Gaza by the Israeli government. So that's why there is a crime, the Rome Statute, and hunger as a weapon of war basically made this clear principles. So starvation is a weapon of war. We know that, and the criminal law, international criminal Rome Statute, Article 8 2b 15. I'm not going to details because these are, it takes 2 more hours, but crimes of starvation is there. It's extremely clear, and intention is there, and the attack is there. Let me stop here. If there's any question, we can go further, but because I went too far of my time, I'm sorry about that. I'm stopping now.
Well, thank you so much, Hilal. That was a very compelling presentation, and thank you for explaining the procedure, the Human Rights Council, the special rapporteurs, what their functions are, and then bringing it home to Gaza. That was a very important presentation. Our next speaker will be Susan Akram. Susan?
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me and for putting together this wonderful program, Marjorie and the People's Academy. I'm going to talk about the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, UNRWA, but I'm going to relate it to the various UN agencies that were established by the UN with some mandates towards Palestinians. UNRWA was established by the UN General Assembly in December of 1949 to provide humanitarian assistance to the hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees forced out of their homes and lands during the 1947-48 conflict in Palestine. UNRWA was not established to provide legal protection to the refugees, as that responsibility had already been entrusted to the United Nations Conciliation Commission on Palestine, the UNCCP, a year earlier. To understand why UNRWA was established and the bifurcated mandate the UN gave to two separate agencies, it's necessary to touch briefly on how the UN responded to the conflict between Zionist Jews and Palestinians in Palestine. Since 1945, the UN's obligations towards the Palestinian refugee problem have rested on the UN Charter, the commitment the UN, and before that, the League of Nations, had made to the majority population in Palestine before partition, and its own responsibility for the expulsion or flight of over 700,000 Palestinian refugees. On 29 November 1947, the General Assembly passed Resolution 181, which recommended dividing the historic area of Palestine into a Jewish and an Arab state. By the end of 1947, Jews constituted approximately 1/3 of the population of Palestine and owned no more than 6% of the land, while Palestinians numbered approximately 1.2 million people and owned over 90% of the land. Under the partition plan, the Jewish state would have a 44% Palestinian population, and the Arab state would have a 1% Jewish population. But in fact, the partition division would provide a Jewish state with a bare majority of Jews, while Jerusalem, to be an international city, would have 100,000 Jews and 105,000 Palestinians. In other words, pretty much parity between both proposed states and Jerusalem. Conflict had already broken out between the two communities prior to the issuance of Resolution 181 and vociferous Arab and Palestinian opposition to division of Palestine by May 15, 1948, when the British mandate over Palestine expired and the British withdrew. Israel declared its state over an area beyond that allocated to the Jewish state in the plan. And before and during the conflict, Israel forced out or coerced about 750,000 Palestinians from their homes and lands, the majority of whom became destitute in the neighboring Arab areas. As the refugees were forced into Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, the West Bank, and Gaza, West Bank then under Jordanian administration, and Gaza under Egyptian administration, the General Assembly passed Resolution 1943 on December 1 of 1948. Now, Resolution 194 created the UN Conciliation Commission on Palestine, or the UNCCP, with a mandate to provide protection for the refugees. UNCCP's protection mandate was first and foremost authorized to achieve a specific durable solution for the entire population of displaced Palestinians. In other words, Palestinians as a national group. The durable solution that UNCCP was required to carry out was to implement the Palestinian refugees' right to return to their homes, obtain restitution of their properties, and compensation for their losses. And this durable solution is spelled out in paragraph 11 of that resolution. UNCCP's mandate was towards all habitual residents or citizens of Palestine, whether displaced by the 47-48 conflict or were unable to return to their homes due to subsequent Israeli control. The UNCCP was given a second mandate, though, that is to resolve the remaining issues between the parties and achieve a resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict. The UNCCP was established as a permanent UN agency entrusted with resolving all aspects of the conflict and the refugee problem, and its mandate has been continued within the General Assembly until today. However, within a very short period of time, it was clear to the UN and to the parties involved that the UNCCP would be unable to fulfill its dual mandate as both mediator and to provide the required durable solution for the refugees due to Israeli intransigence. By the mid-1960s then, the remaining function of the UNCCP, which was to document and archive all the records and titles of Palestinian refugee property, was terminated due to the UN's defunding of its work. Now, in parallel to the UN's actions to provide an agency for international protection and durable solutions for the refugees, the UN was forced to grapple with the massive humanitarian crisis of the large refugee population. So on December 8, 1949, the General Assembly created UNRWA as a short-term relief and works agency to provide for the immediate needs of the refugees. Its services initially extended to a subset of the population under UNCCP's mandate, that is, those who had lost their homes and livelihoods and were in need. By 1951, UNRWA had inherited a list of almost 1 million persons needing relief. It's important to understand that UNRWA's refugee definition is not tied to specific eligibility for refugee protection, but covers groups and categories of displaced and vulnerable Palestinians on the basis of their need for services in the 5 areas of its operation: the West Bank and Gaza, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. And UNRWA's founding resolution 302 made clear that it was Resolution 194 that was the operative legal solution for the refugees, that was to be implemented by the United Nations, pending which UNRWA was required to provide humanitarian assistance to the refugees. Now, UNRWA's initial focus on relief turned to works after the Economic Survey Mission recommended instituting large-scale development projects to settle the refugees in the Arab host states. The focus on integration into the Arab states drew strong pushback, both from the Arab states and from the refugees themselves, who saw it as an effort to prevent their right to return to their homes. By the early 1960s, UNRWA refocused its focus and resources on providing education and healthcare to the refugees, building schools, vocational programs, health clinics, and hospitals throughout the refugee camps. Over time, UNRWA's services have expanded to social services, shelter and camp improvement, microfinance, and microenterprise programs. Following the War of 1967, UNRWA began responding to the ongoing and cyclical need for human rights monitoring and intervention to protect Palestinian refugees who were facing multiple conflicts, both within the Israeli-controlled occupied territories and in the Arab states. UN resolutions increasingly commended UNRWA for taking on certain activities to protect the refugees. In 1990, following the extreme violence faced by Palestinians in the First Intifada, the Security Council passed Resolution 681, which established the Refugee Affairs Officers Program within UNRWA to monitor and report on human rights violations against Palestinians in the occupied territories. The RAO program continued until the Oslo agreements were signed, and then beginning in 2010, UNRWA established a strategy for mainstreaming protection throughout its operations, a permanent protection officer role, and expanded its cooperation with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, to address protection problems vis-à-vis Palestinians that are outside of UNRWA's mandate. So the third agency that has a mandate towards Palestinians, but outside UNRWA's areas, is UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. UNHCR was established under Resolution 428 in December of 1950. It has a very different definition of refugee than the ones that apply to Palestinians under UNCCP and UNRWA. While the latter two are group or category definitions, UNHCR's primary refugee definition is an individualized one under the 1951 Refugee Convention and its statute. UNHCR is the permanent UN agency established to provide both international protection and humanitarian assistance for all refugees and stateless persons other than Palestinians, in contrast to UNRWA, which is still a temporary agency now renewed every 5 years. UNHCR operates in all countries and regions for all refugees, including the Arab states. However, in the Arab states, it is restricted to non-Palestinian refugees. The UN's recognition of its particular responsibility in assisting in creating the refugee problem in the first place, the Palestinian refugee problem, through partitioning the Palestinian homeland, explains the limitations on the mandates of these three agencies towards Palestinian refugees. By the time the UNHCR statute and the 1951 Refugee Convention were passed by the UN, both UNCCP and UNRWA had been established. The General Assembly, as I mentioned, had resolved in Resolution 194 that a particular durable solution was to be achieved by the UN and a particular categorical definition to be applied to all Palestinians forced from their homes and lands. Hence, they incorporated a set of clauses in the UNHCR statute, the 1951 Refugee Convention, and the later 1954 Convention on Stateless Persons, all of which exclude Palestinians from the UNHCR mandate and the coverage of these instruments. These exclusion clauses were meant to reinforce the initial UN intention of creating a special and heightened regime of both protection and humanitarian assistance for the entire population of displaced Palestinians, and to avoid duplication of UN agencies' operations. The regime was intended to implement the durable solution of Resolution 194 and to prevent integration and resettlement as a substitute for the right of return and property restitution to the Palestinians. However, this special regime has led to significant confusion and ambiguity in the definition of who is a Palestine refugee, which agency has the durable solution mandate over Palestinian refugees, and when and where. Experts have termed this problem the protection gap for Palestinian refugees. So over the decades, and with the demise of most of UNCCP's protection role, UNRWA has become the sole agency providing both humanitarian assistance and a range of protection activities for the approximately 6 million Palestinians registered with the agency across its 5 fields. UNRWA has a complicated relationship with the Arab host states in which it operates, with its ability to function dependent on the space it is given in each host country. It registers Palestine refugees and Palestine displaced persons, which are the 2 major categories of service recipients, for registration identification, IDs, but cannot issue other types of status or travel documents. The rights and benefits Palestinians receive, other than UNRWA services, are wholly dependent on the policies of the host states and vary significantly from area to area. For example, prior to the conflict in Syria that started in 2011, Syria was the most generous host state for Palestinians, with no difference in rights and benefits between Palestinian refugees and Syrian citizens, other than the right to vote and own a second property. Lebanon, on the other hand, has been the most restrictive towards Palestinians, excluding them from the ability to own property, obtain long-term residence status, or work in dozens of professions. Meanwhile, a significant jurisprudence has developed to try to interpret UN and individual countries' obligations towards Palestinians inside and outside UNRWA areas. Particularly important are the cases decided in the European Court of Justice of the EU, the CJEU, which has been interpreting the interlocking provisions in the Refugee Convention and the EU's application of international refugee law and the law on stateless persons. A number of cases have clarified some of these provisions, while others have raised additional questions. For example, most countries do not have stateless determination procedures. In those countries that have such procedures, Palestinians have to prove they're stateless. Palestinians, however, do not consider themselves to be stateless. And this is also a conundrum in those countries that recognize Palestine as a state, but cannot return Palestinians to the West Bank or Gaza, as they cannot obtain permission to enter or re-enter, since it's Israel that is ultimately in control of all egress and entry into and out of the occupied territories. These issues compound the protection gap, and Palestinians face complex problems in proving that they are refugees or stateless persons in order to obtain protection and legal status outside of UNRWA areas. For example, a recent Advocate General's opinion at the CJEU has just interpreted whether Palestinians from Gaza should automatically be considered refugees, an extremely important application of the CJEU's jurisprudence on Palestinian claims as stateless refugees. It underscores that UNRWA-registered Palestinians from Gaza should not have to make any evidentiary showing that UNRWA's protection or assistance has ceased in order to obtain refugee status in EU countries. The fact that there is no safety in Gaza is sufficient to prove their eligibility for refugee protection. This is an enormous relief and a breakthrough in the jurisprudence for Palestinians from Gaza in Europe, who in reality have nowhere to return, and an affirmation that there's nowhere safe in Gaza, let alone anywhere within UNRWA's areas of operation. Let me say a word about the termination of funding by UNRWA's main donor countries, following Israeli allegations of the complicity of approximately a dozen UNRWA staff members, which has had catastrophic consequences for the 2 million people in Gaza subjected to massive bombardment, shelling, forced displacement, and now famine, as Hilal has just reviewed. UNRWA is the only organization with the capacity to deliver vital aid to the displaced, starving, and injured Gazans who depend on it for their last lifeline for survival. As Israeli allegations have proved to be unsupported by evidence, Canada and Sweden have recommitted to resuming their aid payments to UNRWA, while other countries have increased their donations. However, the US provides approximately half of all of UNRWA's revenue, so the loss of that single source of aid is hugely consequential. The cuts to UNRWA's funding by its biggest donors has serious ramifications for UNRWA's services to Palestinian refugees in all of its service areas, not only to Gazans. Palestinian refugees in the West Bank, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria are also affected. As I mentioned, UNRWA provides education, housing, health, vocational training, microcredit, and a host of other services essential to the welfare and livelihoods of millions of Palestinian refugees in the Arab host states. Now, as should be evident, because of their opposition to UNHCR resettling refugees, the Arab host states have, as a whole, refused to become parties to the Refugee Convention or the State 1954 Convention on Stateless Persons. At the same time, as I and others have long argued, the League of Arab States countries need to live up to commitments under other treaties, such as the Casablanca Protocol, which they have ratified, and provide Palestinians with all the rights guarantees under regional and international instruments, and at the same time, ensure that these don't undermine the Palestinians' right to return. This reminder is more urgent than ever in light of the mass killings and destruction in Gaza, but also in light of the increased settler and IDF violence against Palestinians in the West Bank. Palestinians need to be ensured of safety and the full range of human rights that the Arab states, under the Casablanca Protocol and other agreements, have committed to and must fulfill. Meanwhile, it's essential to understand that the loss of aid by major donors can cripple the services UNRWA can provide, but it does not end UNRWA as a United Nations organ. As an agency of the UN, only a decision of the General Assembly can terminate UNRWA's mandate entirely. Meanwhile, it is still the UNCCP that has been designated as the United Nations organization responsible for international protection of Palestinian refugees as an entire population. Today, approximately 11 million of the 13 million global population of Palestinians. And the UNCCP continues to exist and issues a letter each year to the General Assembly stating that it is unable to fulfill its mandate. However, Resolution 194 is a unique resolution in that it is the only resolution that has been reaffirmed by the General Assembly every year since its passage. And what that means is that the commitment to the durable solution of return, restitution, and compensation for Palestinians remains the binding international law and the law to be implemented by the UN. UNRWA is not a substitute for the UNCCP's mandate, but UNRWA is essential to ensuring that Palestinian refugees can live in some sort of dignity and get the basic services and rights that they deserve while they're waiting for their durable solution to be implemented by the international community. There's a lot more to say, but I think I will end here and welcome questions.
Thank you, Susan. That was a really useful history of and outline of the function of UNRWA. We see it in the news all the time, but I think that people just don't really understand where it comes from, what it's supposed to do, and what its limitations are. So thank you for that. Next, we have Michael Link. Michael?
Thank you very much, Marjorie, for including me on this panel. It's a great honor to be here, particularly with Susan and Halal, who I've known for both of them for many, many years in their stellar work on international human rights. What I'm going to do today is first talk about the work I've done when I was Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in the occupied Palestinian territory, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the issue of children and international law in Palestine and particularly in Gaza. I was Special Rapporteur between 2016 and 2022. And as Halal has explained, what Special Rapporteurs do is to, among other things, give 2 reports annually to the United Nations, one to the Human Rights Council in Geneva, and the other to the UN General Assembly in New York. And I gave my 12th and last report as UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in the OPT in March of 2022, a little more than 2 years ago. And my final report was on apartheid. And when I appeared before the Council, I said that I would not be here in front of you today delivering a report on how an unrelenting occupation has metastasized into apartheid had the international community taken its own laws seriously 45 and 35 years ago, when the Security Council and the General Assembly first began to adopt their many resolutions with respect to that the occupation had to end, that the occupation was illegal in terms of its annexation of occupied Palestinian land, that the settlements were illegal, and that the denial of Palestinian self-determination was illegal. I said at that time that international law is not meant to be an umbrella that folds up at the first sign of rain. So in my 6 years as Special Rapporteur, what I tried to confront was the issue of accountability. We have lots and lots of law, international humanitarian law, international human rights law, international criminal law, all of which applies plentifully to overseeing the 57-year-old Israeli occupation of Palestinian land. But what we don't have is any form of accountability, of trying to close that titanic gap between promise and performance of international law. Here we have, on the one hand, the entire willingness of the international community who is able to pass resolutions after resolutions in the General Assembly, the Security Council, and the Human Rights Council with respect to Israel's many violations of human rights standards and of international law in its conduct of the occupation. Yet, on the other hand, we have an extraordinary unwillingness, particularly coming from the global north, of the international community's willingness to demand compliance with any of its own laws and its resolutions. Now, at its very best, in the years that I was working as Special Rapporteur, I determined that the UN could be and was an indispensable forum for the question of Palestine to be raised and debated at the United Nations in front of the international community, and for the right of Palestinian self-determination to be endorsed and pursued. The very highest aspirations of the international community, particularly with respect to human rights and self-determination, were expressed through these hundreds and hundreds of resolutions that have been adopted by the Human Rights Council, the General Assembly, and the Security Council with respect to the question of Palestine. the General Assembly has repeatedly stated over the last half century that the United Nations has a permanent responsibility, its words, for the question of Palestine until it is resolved in all of its aspects. And the United Nations has actually devoted considerable resources through its offices and its agencies that are located in Jerusalem, in Gaza, in Ramallah, in Amman, in Beirut, and elsewhere in the Middle East, to the question of Palestine, to monitoring the Israeli occupation, to managing and funding social development projects, to issuing comprehensive human rights reports, including from special rapporteurs, to acting as a good office, and to attempting to ensure, with indifferent support from many parts of the international community, for the well-being and the rights of the Palestinian refugees. But as I discovered during my experience as a special rapporteur, the United Nations is rarely at its best when it comes to the question of Palestine. Far more often, the United Nations has been desperately hobbled by its political inability to act upon the many resolutions that it has passed in support of Palestinian rights, to demand that Israel halt its de jure and its de facto annexation of Palestinian territory, to end its occupation, and to clear the way for Palestinian freedom. At the heart of this institutional inertia has been the United States and its zeal to wind up shielding Israeli intransigence through the Security Council veto to prevent any meaningful action by the one legislative organ, the Security Council of the United Nations, which possesses the power to act decisively against an international outlier. For the UN, this inability to effectively press Israel to end the orphan political status of the Palestinians has acutely stained the UN's reputation and prestige. As Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General of the United Nations between 1997 and 2006, acknowledged in his 2012 memoirs, he said that this failure for the UN, and I'm quoting, has been a deep internal wound as old as the organization itself, given that the Israeli-Arab conflict began at the very inception of the United Nations, a painful and festering sore consequently felt in almost every intergovernmental organ and secretariat body of the United Nations. So if I can just mention a couple of things that I encountered during my time as a special rapporteur. The first thing I want to talk about is the UN database on business enterprises in the Israeli settlements. On the same week that I was elected to become the next special rapporteur in March of 2016, the UN Human Rights Council also adopted a resolution to create a business databank, on business enterprises with respect to both Israeli and foreign businesses who operate in the Israeli settlements and in Israeli settlement zones in the occupied Palestinian territory, particularly in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. The purpose of the database was to shine a spotlight on these companies whose economic activities were facilitating the growth of the settlements and thereby contributing to their well-documented violations of Palestinian human rights. This spotlight had been influenced by the earth-shattering 2011 UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which directed all business enterprises to refrain from contributing to human rights abuses arising from conflict. So when this database was first conceived of through this resolution at the UN Human Rights Council in March of 2016, this was not the first time that the Council had decided to try to put a bright spotlight on business practices and human rights abuses during conflict. This has been done previously with respect to the illegal exploitation of natural resources in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and as well, it had also issued major reports with respect to the involvement of companies controlled by security forces in Myanmar in 2018, 2019. But neither of these reports with respect to the Congo and Myanmar triggered the substantial and sustained backlash that the Israeli settlements database provoked. Some of the over-the-top invective that was hurled at the proposal for this were that it was a blacklist, it was economic terrorism, and that it smacked of anti-Semitism. It was none of these things in truth. It had no judicial or remedial powers. It did not call for a boycott of the settlements, and it was describing actions to address Israel's illegal settlements as anti-Semitic is not only intended to divert attention from the well-established human rights harms that were being caused to the Palestinians, but it also dishonored the very important work to challenge the very real anti-Jewish bigotry that exists in the world today. So there were three issues as special rapporteur that concerned me with respect to the database. First of all, it took the High Commissioner's Office almost 4 years to release the database. Part of this delay can be honestly explained through the concern to create a rigorous methodology that would fact check, double check, and triple check all of its gathered information to ensure which business enterprises were actually operating in the Israeli settlements and the Israeli industrial zones in the OPT. But this alone does not explain the inordinate length of time that it took for the database to appear. The High Commissioner's Office, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, both of the High Commissioners who served during the period of time when the database was coming into play, both of them encountered enormous lobbying pressure, particularly led by the United States and Israel, to derail the database from ever seeing the light of day. And perhaps in reaction to this lobbying pressure, the resources that were devoted by the High Commissioner's Office and the Human Rights Council to creating the database were small and insubstantial in comparison to the importance of its work. The second concern that I had with respect to the database was the conservative approach that was taken by the High Commissioner's Office with respect to the mandate. When it was finally released in February 2020, 4 years ago, the database identified 112 businesses that were involved in the settlements. Of these, 94 of them were Israeli, and the rest were from the US, the United Kingdom, France, the Netherlands, Thailand, and Luxembourg. And among the list of companies were companies that are well known probably to many of you, such as Airbnb, Booking.com, and Expedia. But there also were glaring and inexplicable omissions from the database as well. The Heidelberg Cement Company of Germany, which operated stone quarries in several of the Israeli settlements in the West Bank, was missing from the database, as was FIFA, the International Federation of Soccer or Football Associations. It permitted its Israeli subsidiary, the Israeli Football Association, to include 6 teams that were in the Israeli settlements in violations of FIFA's own statute. And the third thing that concerned me was, since its release in February and March of 2020, the database has become a virtual dead letter. There's been virtually no resources put into it by the Human Rights Council or the High Commissioner's Office with respect to trying to revitalize and to keep the database up to date. When I raised these issues at the High Commissioner's Office, it was often explained to me that for a variety of technical issues, it was not possible to be able to maintain the personnel in order to keep the database current and up to date. Although this database was never going to be more than a small step to try to hold Israel accountable with respect to putting a spotlight on international businesses and Israeli businesses that were economically revitalizing the settlements. It was nevertheless a highly visible signal that sustained defiance of international law by an acquisitive occupying power would not go unanswered. The other thing I just want to raise with respect to my work as special rapporteur is Resolution 2334, This is a resolution of the Security Council that you may not have heard of. It was adopted in December 2016, which was about 6 to 7 months into my tenure as a special rapporteur. This was passed by the Security Council in December 2016 in the waning weeks of the Obama regime. It has been and is the only resolution that has been adopted by the Security Council that's critical of Israel since February of 2009. So over 15 years, this is the one and only resolution that has actually put a harsh spotlight on Israel by the Security Council. And this goes to, I guess, illustrating the extraordinary power that the United States has as a permanent member wielding a veto to be able to control discussion and the work of the Security Council and trying to hold Israel accountable with respect to its many violations of international law. What Resolution 2334 did was to focus primarily on the Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territory. As you probably know now, there are around 300 of these settlements, and they're growing in terms of the number of settlements every year. Either new ones are being established or ones that had not been officially recognized by Israel are now being rehabilitated and given official municipal status by the occupying power. What Resolution 2334 did was to call the Israeli settlements, and I'm quoting its own words, a flagrant violation under international law, and stressing that they are dangerously imperiling what is left of a two-state solution, and indeed they're entrenching a one-state reality. And it demanded that Israel immediately, I'm quoting again, immediately and completely cease all settlement activities in the occupied Palestinian territory. And it also asked for the Secretary General of the United Nations to make a quarterly report every year, every 4 times a year, to the Security Council that would explain, among other things, whether Israel is in compliance with its demand to stop all of its settlement activities. Now, this should have been a triumph of responsible diplomacy in holding Israel to account. But this soon became just yet another exercise in the inexhaustible capacity of the leading political decision makers on the Israeli occupation to avert their gaze away from the facts proliferating in front of their noses. In each of the subsequent 29 quarterly reports that the UN Secretary General has issued since the beginning of 2017, every one of those 29 reports by the Secretary General has said that Israel is not in compliance with any of the demands placed upon it by the Security Council in this Resolution 2334 adopted in December 2016. And what we have now is, because countries, either the other 4 permanent members on the Security Council or the 10 members who are elected for a 2-year term on a non-permanent basis, see no point in trying to bring another resolution with respect to the Israeli settlements, either under the administration of Donald Trump or under the administration of Joseph Biden, was knowing that the United States would oppose it and would attempt to veto it. So we have, when the resolution was passed in December 2016, we had just under 400,000 Israeli settlers living in the settlements in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. Now, more than 7 years later, we now have 520,000 Israeli settlers, an increase of around 23% in the number of settlers living in occupied territory, all because the Security Council cannot muster the diplomatic will to be able to confront Israel with respect to that, because of the extraordinary diplomatic shield being given to Israel by the United States, whether a Democratic administration or a Republican administration. And let me say, quote 2 people whose names are perhaps familiar to you, who will endorse, I guess, the spotlight on the United States. Ban Ki-moon, who was the Secretary General of the United Nations between 2007 and 2016, in his memoirs, after he left office, he lamented, and I'm quoting, the political cover provided by successive U.S. governments to Israel, which is, he said, partly to blame for this lack of accountability. And in his presidential memoirs published in 2020, Barack Obama observed that America's shielding of Israel's violations of international law meant, in Barack Obama's words, quote, our American diplomats, found themselves in the awkward position of having to defend Israel for actions that we ourselves opposed. So all of this says that even senior decision makers, either in the United Nations or at the very top of the American government, recognize, I guess, the extraordinary clout that Israel has with respect to this through the use of American military support, but just as importantly, through American diplomatic support as well. So what I want to be able to do now is to, if I can be made co-host, I want to be able to provide you with a short PowerPoint that I would talk about with respect to children's rights in Palestine. I don't see anything coming on my screen. So this short PowerPoint I'm going to give you talks about the work both of two important UN agencies, UNICEF and UNESCO. UNICEF is the UN organization with respect to children's rights, and UNESCO is the UN organization with respect to economic, scientific, and cultural rights within the UN system. So I'm going to spend the first part of the slideshow or PowerPoint with respect to children's rights. And just to give you the very briefest of history lessons, a century ago, there virtually was no rights at all for children in international law or in most countries as well. In 1921, the League of Nations, which is the predecessor for the United Nations, adopted its very first international conventions with respect to children, which prohibited the trafficking of children for the purposes of either labor or for kidnapping them, for removal into new families. And it also went prohibiting slavery, including slavery of children. Fast forward to 1948, and we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which stated that motherhood and children were entitled to special care and assistance. Things began to change beginning the end of the 1950s with respect to children's rights. And here we see the UN General Assembly adopting the Declaration of the Rights of the Child, which presaged 30 years later the adoption of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which I'll take you to in a minute. But there were a series of other UN conventions on minimum age to consent to marriage, on the minimum age with respect to working, passed by the International Labor Organization, and protocols to the Geneva Conventions on children engaged in conflict, and also on the worst forms of child labor convention. These were all important ones, but there was no convention that is more meaningful with respect to the rights of the child than the one passed 35 years ago by the United Nations on the Convention of the Rights of the Child. And this is one of the most successful conventions ever adopted by the United Nations. It's certainly the most widely ratified of any international convention put forth for signatures by the United Nations. It defines a child, as you can see, as anyone under the age of 18. It created as a supervisory body the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child in order to be able to provide, I guess, a oversight to the operation of the convention, and which would require all signatories to submit regular reports to this committee on the rights of the child to discuss their monitoring at their own national level on the rights of the child, in addition to the ability to be able to receive more critical reports coming from NGOs or other organizations with a special interest in children's rights. And these are the four core principles that all children everywhere in the world are entitled to under the convention. It's non-discrimination, the devotion to the best interest of the child, the right to life, survival, and development, and respect for the views of the child in all circumstances. And in the heart of the convention, these following 6 rights are laid out in some detail. I'll just very briefly summarize them for you. The first is the right to the best health care possible, and that also includes having safe water to drink, having nutritious food to be able to eat, and enjoying and being surrounded by a clean and safe environment. The second is the right to food, clothing, a safe place to live, and to have your basic needs met. The third is the right to a good quality education. The fourth, which is very interesting, is treating children as people endowed with rights, the right to give your opinion and for adults to listen and take it seriously. Fifth is the right to be protected from being hurt and mistreated, in particular, having the right to be free from sexual abuse. And sixthly, the right to protection of any sort of exploitation. And in addition to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, we have 2 particular instruments of international law that protect children who may find themselves in armed conflict and/or under occupation. The first is the 4th Geneva Convention of 1949, and the protocol additional that was attached to it that was negotiated and adopted in 1977, which says that children in a situation of being in a conflict zone shall be the object of special respect, and that lethal force is justified against any civilian only when there's a direct and imminent threat to life or serious injury being present. And then there is an optional protocol that was added to the Convention on the Rights of the Child in the year 2000 with respect to children in armed conflict, which says that the rights of children require special protection, and and also condemning the targeting of children in situations of armed conflict. So that's the background law that I want you to keep in mind as we begin to go through the particular case of Palestine, both in the occupied territories generally and in Gaza in particular. So my focus for the next 15 or so slides has to do with what a number of responsible organizations, including UNICEF, including UNESCO, including NGOs like Defense for Children International and Save the Children, have said in numerous reports with respect to their observation of whether or not these rights are being protected by Israel, the occupying power, in the Palestinian territory. So the first thing I just want to be able to lay out for you, and I do this in virtually every lecture that I give with respect to Israel and Palestine, is how highly unequal, how highly asymmetrical this particular struggle is. You consider the first 4 of these points that I have here in the PowerPoint. Militarily, Israel is by far the dominant power vis-a-vis the Palestinians. It is a nuclear power. It has the strongest armed forces in the region. It has an enduring military relationship with the United States, and therefore has all state-of-the-art military equipment in terms of jets, in terms of tanks, in terms of artillery, in terms of weapons, in terms of training of its army, where the Palestinians have either a police force in the West Bank, or they would have very poorly equipped militias in Gaza with homemade rockets. Economically, Israel enjoys a European-style standard of living. Its GDP is around $56,000 to $57,000 American per person, where the GDP for Palestinians under Israeli occupation is around $4,000 to $4,500 a year American per capita, which is a GDP gap of 14 times. Territorially, Israel is the only dominant political power between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. The Palestinians have, if you like, municipal-like powers ranging from Jenin in the north of the West Bank to Hebron in the south of the West Bank. Obviously, there was Hamas had territorial foot in ruling and running, administrating Gaza before October 2023. But Israel maintained a comprehensive 17-year-old air, sea, and land blockade on Gaza, which controlled everybody and everything that went in or left the Gaza Strip. Diplomatically, the Palestinians enjoy the support of most countries in the global south, which is where the overwhelming population of the globe resides. But that doesn't offset the more powerful relationships that Israel has with the United States, first and foremost, and also with the European Union, which tends, unfortunately, to count for much more than a mobilized support of the global south. The only area in all of these factors that I've listed where there is equality is on demographics. Right now, between the river and the sea, there are 7.2 million Palestinian Arabs and 7.2 million Israeli Jews. And that population balance is increasingly in the favor of the Palestinian Arabs, whose population is growing at a faster rate than those of the Israeli Jews. So with respect to the Israeli occupation in particular, a number of reports that have been issued particularly over the last 2 decades, have pointed out the kinds of violence that Palestinian children face, whether they're in Gaza, whether they're in East Jerusalem, whether they're in the West Bank, and this would include, with respect to imprisonment, anywhere at any year. Certainly in the figures I've seen over the last 7 to 8 years, somewhere between 500 and 700 Palestinian children are imprisoned each year. And the death rate with respect to children, you can see the figures I've got there initially are between January 2008 and October 2023. Approximately 1,434 Palestinian children have been killed at the hands of either Israeli settlers or the Israeli army. During the same period of time, 25 Israeli children were killed. And just in terms of mortality rates, and this is to show you the stark difference in living conditions that an Israeli Jewish child would have as opposed to a Palestinian child living under occupation. In terms of the infant mortality rate, 12.7 Palestinian children will die in infancy per every 1,000 live births, as opposed to 2.7 Israeli Jewish children dying in their infancy per 1,000 live births. And when you look at the mortality rate of Palestinian and Israeli children under the age of 5, 14.8 Palestinian children will die under the age of 5 per 1,000 live births, as opposed to 3.4 Israeli children dying under the age of 5 per 1,000 live births. So a rate of around 4 times the number of Palestinian children will die in comparison to Israeli children. In terms of imprisonment and their treatment, I include this comment by Save the Children UK, which has a substantial program with respect to trying to protect Palestinian children in the occupied Palestinian territories. And Jeremy Stoner of Save the Children said that children as young as 12 have told us about truly inhumane treatment in the Israeli military detention system. There is no possible justification for setting dogs on children, beating them, or shackling them to metal chairs. Whether they are accused of whatever they're accused of, regardless of guilt or innocence, these children must first be treated as first and foremost as children with all the special protections. And he's referring obviously to both the Geneva Conventions and to the Conventions on the Right of the Child that these special protections wind up entailing. Another feature that has been pointed to with respect to NGOs specializing in children's rights that they pointed to is with respect to home demolitions. And obviously the demolition of a home, which is quite promiscuous and frequent in the occupied Palestinian territories, particularly in the West Bank, will affect the entire family, but it has a particular impact upon children. You see here, since 1967, there's been approximately 28,000 homes have been demolished, and these would be primarily in the West Bank, displacing and forcibly transferring tens of thousands of children. And I must say, these figures are before the Gaza war beginning in October 2023. 70% of Palestinian children after home demolition interviewed reported feeling socially isolated. 60% of those whose homes were demolished said their education had been jeopardized or interrupted. 80% said they felt abandoned and had lost faith in anyone seeking to try to protect their rights. We know in terms of housing in Gaza since the beginning of October that at a very conservative number, over 360,000 homes in Gaza have either been entirely destroyed or badly damaged by the Israeli assault on Gaza. So in many ways, what's happened in Gaza in the last 6 months has completely eclipsed the level of home demolitions or home loss in the West Bank. And this was, I'm quoting from a report by the United Kingdom's Save the Children organization called Hope Under the Rubble, which was published a couple of years ago. And they said in the report, the demolition of Palestinian homes, the expropriation of Palestinian land, and the resulting displacement and forced transfer are not only illegal under international law, but are an obstacle to the fulfillment of children's rights, including the right to a standard of living adequate for their development. Probably the most prominent organization in the West Bank defending Palestinian children's rights is Defense of Children International Palestine. It was labeled in November 2021 as a terrorist organization by the Israeli government. It had its offices raided on a number of occasions, and this is a grab from a screenshot of Israeli soldiers overnight going through and ultimately ransacking the offices of Defense of Children International Palestine, including taking all of their computers with them. And this is not unusual for the kind of harassment that Palestinian human rights organizations in the West Bank would wind up regularly facing. The organization that I'd mentioned a few minutes ago, UNICEF, plays a particularly prominent role in its attempt to try to offer, if you like, soft law protection for Palestinian children living under the Israeli occupation. The work of UNICEF in Palestine it's actually got a very wide scope to it. And it's pointed out in its annual reports that while the Palestinian economy has either been going stagnant or in fact declining, as it has over the last 15 years in Gaza in particular, this means that child poverty rates are exceptionally high, that food insecurity is also high, and the kind of work that UNICEF does includes trying to lower the rates of child mortality with respect to having joint programs with the World Health Organization and with Palestinian health partners on the ground, tackling the high rates of acute malnutrition, predominantly in Gaza, building the education capacity by assisting with the creation of new school books, with the creation of where they can find funding to be able to build new schooling for the swelling population of young Palestinian children wanting to be able to go into schools, of trying to protect children from violence and exploitation, of trying to, if you like, to create a culture that respects children and recognizes that children have inherent rights, of trying to improve educational outcomes, especially for young girls, of improving the access to clean water, which is particularly desperate in Gaza even before October 2023, and for trying to provide opportunities for work and for education for children with disabilities. So with respect to children in Gaza, the Save the Children's most recent reports have said that there have been 13,800 Palestinian children have been killed since October 2023 in Gaza during the 6 months of the war. Keep that in mind, that's over 2,000 children a month. There have been more children killed in Gaza in the 6 months of this war than there have been in terms of children dying worldwide in all armed conflicts over the last 5 years. That's a stunning statistic in my view. In the West Bank, there have been 114 children have been killed by either Israeli soldiers or Israeli settlers since the beginning of October. So that puts us almost at 14,000 children, Palestinian children, have died since October 7th. UNICEF estimates that at least 1,000 children have had either one or both legs amputated in Gaza. And you can only imagine that there must be many more children who have suffered grievously with respect to destroyed limbs, because almost all of the hospitals in Gaza have been put out of commission over the course of the 6-month war. We've had many medical specialists who have been killed, and there's virtually no area where they can safely do operations anymore for the kinds of amputations that they see being brought in by people wounded, badly wounded by bombing and bombs and missiles. Oops, I apologize. And here as well, we have reports with respect to mental health experts saying that as protective factors like homes, schools, families are ripped away in the course of this war, and the continual displacement of Palestinians in Gaza further and further to the south of the Gaza Strip, children are likely to suffer lasting psychosocial impacts, including PTSD regarding this. So in Gaza, UNICEF has been calling for, as much of the world has been calling for, an immediate and lasting humanitarian ceasefire. It's been calling for the unrestricted and safe humanitarian access to provide aid to all parts of Gaza, particularly to the 300,000 or so Palestinians in the north of Gaza, where it already appears that a famine has set in, which is the 5th and highest stage on the food security indicators maintained by international food agencies that look after this. So, as I say, 300,000 Palestinians in the north are at the stage 5. There is no stage 6. There's also calling for the immediate, safe, and unconditional release of all children who have been abducted. That means either arrested, or I don't believe there are any more Israeli children who've been held hostage since the release of a number of hostages at the end of November. Obviously, respect and protection for civilian infrastructure, which has been utterly destroyed during the course of the 6 months, such as shelters, foods, utilities. And finally, the allowance of urgent medical cases in Gaza to be able to safely access critical health services for children, for injured and sick children, either in Gaza, which is almost now impossible, or to have access outside of Gaza for this. I also, and I'm underselling the kind of work that UNESCO is doing, and it's only because of the limited amount of time that I have. But I want to be able to point out that the work of UNESCO, the United Nations Economic, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, has been indispensable with respect to trying to ensure that there's at least an effort to protect rights of Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territories for the last number of decades of this occupation. Now, one of the key rights protected in the conventions that apply to UNESCO's work, obviously, is the right to education. And this is a central focus of UNESCO's work everywhere, but in particular in the OPT. The right to education, as I say there, is a prerequisite to achieving other rights of the child and for realizing the child's full potential. There's been no schooling at all since the 8th or 9th of October. As a result of the war, over 625,000 Palestinian children of the 2.2 or 2.3 million Palestinians who live in the Gaza Strip have had no school since that period of time. Not only that, virtually all of the schools in Gaza have either been destroyed, and those few that are remaining are sheltering thousands and thousands of Palestinians who have been displaced from their homes further north. An area that I'm interested in as a one-time university professor is the fact that all 11 Palestinian universities in Gaza have either been destroyed deliberately or badly damaged by Israel since October 7th. Thousands of university students have been killed. in the course of this war. Hundreds of university leaders and professors have also been killed over the last 6 months as well. And we have these brand new words, alas, that are now coming into the English language, euticide or scholasticide, these newly invented words that go to the destruction of education and now are being added to the international legal vocabulary. So my last slide here is simply how to protect children under occupation. And really, maybe it's because I'm not imaginative as an international lawyer, but it has to be at the core of whatever is done, the full application of international law. Our problem in the modern world, particularly when it comes to Israel and Palestine, is not the lack of law. We have lots and lots of laws in international humanitarian law, international human rights law, international criminal law, to be able to offer protection, full protection, to the Palestinians in the OPT, were these laws to be honored, obeyed, and enforced. And that is not happening. The issue of accountability, as both Susan and Hillel have mentioned in their respective reports, lies at the very heart of this. And I'll just very briefly mention in my closing words the fact that there is a file that's opened at the prosecutor's office at the International Criminal Court in The Hague, which is responsible for enforcing the Rome Statute of 1998. And the Rome Statute prohibits war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and wars of aggression. Alas, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, that office has had this file open for almost 9.5 years, with virtually no progress made, and certainly no arrest warrants being issued with respect to those who may have committed war crimes. We've had comprehensive reports delivered by independent commissions of inquiry in 2009, 2015, and 2019 to the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva with respect to prior assaults on Gaza. And each of those 3 prior reports pointed to Israel in particular and said it's very likely that war crimes have been committed by senior political and military leaders in Gaza, in Israel's operations in Gaza. And yet there's been no steps taken, either generally through the world, in the international community, or specifically by the prosecutor's office at the ICC in order to try to enforce this. The other area where international legal justice is being, if you like, in the spotlight, is at the International Court of Justice. And that is also a court in The Hague. It's the highest court in the international UN system. And many of you would know and be familiar with the fact that in January of 2024, 2.5 months ago, the International Court of Justice, after hearing an application by South Africa with respect to the allegations of genocide being committed by Israel in Gaza during its conduct of the war, said there was a plausible case that Israel had been committing genocide, and issued a number of provisional measures, which Israel has gone on to blow through and not obey, including committing no acts of a contributed genocide, and to allow the full amounts of humanitarian aid to be able to reach all parts of Gaza. The International Court of Justice then 3 weeks ago issued new provisional orders on Israel, saying there's a very real possibility you haven't been keeping, you haven't obeyed the ones issued in January. Here are new ones for you to obey, of course, and then Israel has blown through those as well. And the last thing I want to say is that there's a separate proceeding in front of the International Court of Justice that was initiated in December 2022 by the United Nations General Assembly, asking for an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice as to whether or not the 57-year-old occupation is still lawful or not. That's never been tested in an international court. So there were arguments made by over 50 countries and 3 international organizations in late February in front of the court, and we're expecting a decision from the court on its answers to this request for an advisory opinion sometime in June or July or August of this year. What Palestine and many other countries argued was that Israel's occupation had now become illegal because, number one, Israel had, as an occupying power, had annexed both de facto and de jure Palestinian land, which is absolutely forbidden and which amounts to a war of aggression. They also argued, number two, that Israel has been denying the Palestinian right to self-determination, and number three, that Israel has been practicing a system of apartheid in the occupied Palestinian territories. They said any one of these three would be sufficient to be able to find that the Israeli occupation was illegal, and that if it is illegal, that there are legal consequences for Israel, for the United Nations, and for the international community to follow, to bring the occupation to a complete, immediate, and unconditional end, and allow the emergence of a Palestinian state. So with all that, I know I've given you a lot, and I think all three of us have given you a lot. I think we've given you a lot to think over. Let me undo my sharing of my screen, and I'll turn it back to Marjorie.
Well, thank you so much, Michael, for your comprehensive evaluation of the role and limitations of the special rapporteurs on Palestine, as well as international protections for children and Israeli violations of those protections and the role of UNICEF and UNESCO. So thank you so much for that. Thank you all to our faculty members. This has been, I think, a really stellar program. We're going to have some interchange between the faculty members now, followed by questions from the registrants. And I would just like to make a few comments to start off the discussion among the faculty that came to mind. First of all, Hilal talked about the asymmetry of the protection of civil and political rights as opposed to economic, social, and cultural rights. I just want to say the United States has ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, but refuses to ratify the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which would protect the right of workers to strike, the right to work, retirement, education, housing. These were considered by the US government, I believe, starting with the Reagan administration, but certainly since then as well, as akin to socialism. So we certainly can't ratify that treaty. Secondly, the issue of ecocide as a war crime. In 2009, we held a People's Tribunal in support of Tribunal of Conscience in support of the Vietnamese victims of Agent Orange in Paris, had a number of testimonies from scientists, from lawyers, from victims, from journalists, from US soldiers, and determined that in fact the spraying of Agent Orange by the US in Vietnam did constitute a war crime of ecocide. Third, in terms of UNRWA, there is another case pending in the ICJ, Nicaragua versus Germany. The hearing took place on Monday and Tuesday. Nicaragua is suing Germany for facilitating genocide by continuing to provide weapons to Israel in support of that genocide and defunding UNRWA. And one of the provisional measures that Nicaragua is requesting is that Germany must reverse its decision to suspend funding for UNRWA. And then finally, Michael, you mentioned the UN database on business enterprises and the resistance to issuing it. And I'm wondering if that was partially motivated by the strength of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which was certainly relying on this database to inform people about what particular companies and corporations are operating in the occupied Palestinian territory and which should be boycotted. So anyway, those are just a few of my comments and questions. Maybe you might be able to speak to some of them or none of them, but I wanted to open the program now to the faculty members to discuss amongst yourselves. Thank you.
Who will be the first? You want me to start?
Sure.
You're the obvious choice.
Wow, thank you. Starting with this, why this kind of the problems actually between economic and social rights, civil and political rights. The one is ideological stand, as I said before, comes from the Cold War period. The second is United States is considering economic social rights are not rights. They are a kind of, because they make the distinction between positive rights and the negative rights. And the real rights, for instance, for the US is the freedom of speech or freedom of religion. They are kind of responsibility of the state just not doing anything that the citizens can bring their rights. But the economic, social, cultural rights, they give the responsibility to states. That's why US doesn't accept this in terms of kind of, as you said, socialism, because these are the policies that states can do that, but the citizen cannot have a right to ask for that. The part of the issue is also a US system, the federal system, the responsibility of federal state and responsibility of the states. So this policies goes to the individual states rather than the federal power. They don't want to interfere the kind of individual states policy. That's the part of the argument. United States, they don't accept economic and social rights as a legal right. So that's, of course, it was criticized and completely denied by many of the human rights philosophers, Henry Shue and Amartya Sen, all of them. But the most recently, after the Cold War period is over, the free market system is not very happy with the kind of argument of the economic and social rights, because in this case, the state's interference for protection its citizens for the services, it interferes also free market capitalist order. So that is the major problem that still we have been doing, because there's a one side is the protection of the vulnerables, giving the social structure to the people. On the other side, or market can solve everything. We don't have to interfere the domain of the market. That is the major issue. So ecocide is, yes, during the Vietnam period, first time it came to the conversation in international arena. And the US first was kind of reluctant to discuss on that, especially in the environmental summits, Stockholm summit, for instance, because they didn't like to be responsible from what was happening in Vietnam. When I had a mission trip in Vietnam, also Vietnamese government was very reluctant when I put my report about the ecocide and the impact of the Vietnam War on the Vietnamese nature. You know the reason? They said, well, you know what? We want to sell our rice right now. It's a very important issue for us, exporting rice, and we are very active on that. If you tell openly that the soil was still dirty, polluted, we will not be able to sell our rice. So that's a very interesting counter argument that I was exposed when I was in Vietnam. So Vietnamese try to forget about this. And the US is trying to give some compensation, but not very clear one. But still I can see, I visited many of the orphanage, that the birth defects are still continuous, especially heavily kind of put the warehouses in central Vietnam. It's a very serious issue because many of the remnants of still there, not only Agent Orange, but also some kind of arms. So this is again, it's an important issue. Of course, ecocide came up with the climate change right now, much more to a human agenda. But now we have clear crimes in the humanitarian, international humanitarian law, but there is no such criminal court cases in relation to ecocide. We need to make it much more visible. Well, International Criminal Court is so quiet against Gaza. I mean, what is doing Mr. Khan is a question mark. I mean, we see, and every whole world is seeing what is happening in Gaza, still not a clear prosecution action doing something in Gaza. We are waiting for when Mr. Khan do something else. So I don't know much about the Nicaragua versus Germany because it's very new, and I was doing some other things. So I think I give this issue to Michael. Hopefully Michael say something more about me. And the database issue is, of course, it was an important thing because business and human rights is a very major issue in the Human Rights Council. And many years, they are trying to make an international convention about the business and human rights, which means human rights violations by the private sector. Because as you know, international human rights are making responsible only states. But now, recent years, a private sector violation is much more severe. So this convention is going on very slowly because United States and the European Union does not want any kind of binding convention in relation to business and human rights. That's larger, much more larger than the situation in Palestine. That is a big kind of understanding and the action, but the global South and global North again divided for this issue. Global South is pushing this convention. Global North doesn't want that. But of course, in the Palestine issue, as Michael said, US and Israel successfully is trying to hide it. But I think after the Gaza war, they will not be able to hide many things. Thank you.
I can comment briefly on Nicaragua and Germany, and thank you, Marjorie, for drawing that to my attention. As you mentioned, there were hearings held on Monday and Tuesday this week with respect to Nicaragua's application to the International Court of Justice under the Genocide Convention and under the Geneva Conventions of 1949, that Germany, by supplying Israel with military weapons and missiles, was contributory to the genocide that's going on in Gaza. Keep in mind this: somewhere around 68% of all military sales to Israel come from the United States. Germany is a very solid second at around 28 to 29%, and then the rest of the world is around 3 or 4%. A number of countries, including my country, Canada, Japan, the Netherlands, Norway, have stopped military sales to Israel over the last couple of months. How long that will continue, we will have to wind up seeing. But Nicaragua brought this application at the very beginning of March in order to be able to argue that Germany should be ordered by the International Court of Justice to stop its sale of weapons to Israel in circumstances where these weapons were likely being used to commit war crimes under international humanitarian law and genocide under the Genocide Convention. So that was a thrust of Nicaragua's arguments on Monday. And they, I think, submitted a 45-page application. Tuesday was Germany's turn to reply. Germany raised a number of procedural issues, i.e., there's a very obscure issue that I'd never heard of before the last couple of months called the monetary gold principle, which, one second, which basically says is that you can't have proceedings in front of the International Court of Justice if you don't have the country which is, I guess, at the center of the dispute involved here. Nicaragua was saying, look, we have a dispute with Germany because Germany's supplying of weapons to Israel. Germany is arguing that it's not us, it's Israel that should be the party here in front of the court, and that there's been no finding that Israel is committing genocide. Any case against us will have to wait until after the next 3 or 4 years, until the South Africa Israel case winds up being heard on its merits as to whether or not what Israel has done over the last 6 months in Gaza amounts to a genocide or not. All the court found in January was that there was a plausible case of genocide, and therefore provisional measures, which I think we would know in Canada and the United States as injunctions, should be issued with regards to this. So then on the substance, Germany argued, look, yes, while our arms sales to our military sales to Israel jumped by I think 10 times the amount of the value from 2022 to 2023. Almost everything we sell to Israel is non-lethal. It's vests, it's uniforms, it's binoculars. So they're arguing that even putting Nicaragua's case at its highest, we're not selling something that could be used meaningfully in a genocide. So what we will expect out of this is for the court to issue a decision in a couple of weeks' time as to whether or not it's going to order provisional measures or not, i.e., did Nicaragua establish a plausible case that Germany's military sales to Israel are contributing to a genocide in Gaza. If it says yes, then it'll probably order some provisional measures to Germany that they have to comply with. If they say, and then there would be a trial several years down the road on the full merits of Nicaragua's case against Germany. And if they say no, that Nicaragua hasn't made out a case of a plausible support by Germany for a genocide in Gaza, that's the end of the case. So we'll find out in a few weeks what the court is going to do on this. But this has all of a sudden turned a very busy spotlight, a very busy legal political spotlight on the International Court of Justice in a way that it's rarely ever seen before. We've had now, if you like, 3 major cases involving what is going on in Israel and Palestine in front of the court. The South African application, the request for an advisory opinion that was heard in February, and now this Nicaragua case that was heard this past week. And I'm sure that the court, which is generally quite cautious and conservative, it did something quite bold and remarkable with its decision in January. Will that be continued with what it winds up issuing in the summer with regards to the request for an advisory opinion? And will it continue this newfound boldness with respect to Nicaragua's application when it issues a decision sometime probably by the end of this month or the beginning or sometime in May?
I'm not sure I really have, there's more to say about Nicaragua versus Germany. I'm not sure I have that much to add before I hope we have some time for audience questions. But I just wanted to remind people that there was a Russell Tribunal on Palestine in 2012. And in New York and in Geneva and in South Africa, I believe, there were hearings in at least 3 countries. And there was significant testimony about the violations of international human rights law and humanitarian law. You know, now we've just covered more of that ground and more recent ground, but there was a tremendous effort to bring experts together from various parts of the world for the Russell Tribunal. And I'm not sure that very much was made of those proceedings and conclusions, but it's certainly worth revisiting the incredible testimony. And even at that time, ecocide was discussed, and many of these terms that we are considering as new terms were raised back then. I believe there was another attempt to start proceedings on a tribunal for Gaza, but I'm not sure what has happened with that. In any case, I think we don't have too much time, and it would be great to hear some questions from our audience.
Okay, well, thank you for that. There are some questions. I'm going to just briefly summarize them, and then maybe anybody on the panel who wants to respond to any or all of them can do so. First of all, the Human Rights Council is often criticized or delegitimized because it has members who are important violators of human rights. Do you want to comment on that? Secondly, what recourse do NGOs have to make the special rapporteurs comply with their mandates? AAJ, the American Association of Jurists, and 250 or more NGOs have tried to hold the special rapporteurs accountable for the proposed draft for the Covenant on Transnational Corporations to comply with Resolution 26.9, saying that it's a legally binding treaty on transnational corporations. That's the second issue. And then there is an early warning and urgent action procedures before the Committee on Racial Discrimination, which is the treaty body for the International Convention on All Forms of Racial Discrimination, or the UN Human Rights Council and special rapporteurs. So does anybody want to comment on this early warning and urgent action procedures? And then for anyone considering a career in like being a special rapporteur, what are the dangers and personal risks involved, long periods of living outside one's country or nationality? So those are just some of the questions that people may want to respond to, some or all of them.
You want me to start first again?
Yeah, that sounds sure.
Very, very short. Yes, Human Rights Council were criticized because there are many of the members are human rights violator. It's very true. Show me one country that they are not human rights. They're not human rights violators. It's very, very few. So in this case, but there was something very interesting happened in actually in 2022. Russia was suspended from the Human Rights Council following the US leadership push after his innovation of invasion of Ukraine, which is very, very, very unusual case that happened in Human Rights Council. But this shows that if there is a political will acting together in some countries, that could be a possibility to sort of taking action in Human Rights Council against some violations. But this is, of course, geopolitical decision. Can we do it same thing to US or to Israel? That if they are member, of course, US is member. I don't think so. Israel is a member right now. But that's kind of things the states are basically negotiating constantly in the Human Rights Council. For instance, Saudi Arabia seems to be immune from every kind of criticism because they're very close to the United States. So that's a kind of, whoever asked the question, yes, there's a geopolitics is going on very strongly in Human Rights Council. But this doesn't mean that Human Rights Council is has to be dismantled or they're not doing the right job. They do the right job, but they do sometimes very slowly, depending on personal relationships sometimes. That's why it's an important thing to keep this conversation going on in Geneva. I don't know anything about the Racial Discrimination Committee and what NGOs are extremely important. If there is no cooperation between NGOs and human rights experts, the special rapporteurs, we can't do anything. It's a very, very important to keep alive human rights organizations, especially in the developing countries, because the Western human rights NGOs are very active, very effective, they have enough money, but the global South NGOs needs definitely help and support. So that is a very important. What is the personal coming to last one, personal risk? Yeah, of course, personal risk, a lot of personal risk. I have a lot of criticism, not because of who am I, but my family connection. Who am I? With whom I am connected? Which country I'm coming from? Why I am saying this? Why I'm not saying that? And more importantly, our academic future even destroyed after I made some of the statements. So the universities becomes reluctant to give you more prominent position. These are personal risks. It's not something the risk that you stay long time for outside of your country. No, you basically stay in your wherever you are, and you go 2 times to mission reports, 2 weeks, 2 weeks, and 4 times, 2 times Geneva and New York. Basically, you are staying in your own country, in your own place. This doesn't mean that we are sitting in Geneva, we are sitting in New York. That's a very misleading understanding. Personal risks are important, but it is worth to take, because how many you have the enemies and you have the very good friends, you have supporters, you have solidarity groups, you go further, you go find the like-minded people to work with them. So that's, you have to calculate about what you do for your professional life. If you want to do the big business, don't be the special rapporteur, because that's not going to be helpful for your post special rapporteurship position. Thank you.
I think Hillel did a good job in going through all of those. And a couple of the questions that Hillel couldn't answer, I don't think I could answer either. I don't know enough with respect to holding some special rapporteurs accountable. Certainly, the vast majority of the special rapporteurs I met and dealt with during the 6 years I held my own position, I found were conscientious, were extremely talented, and did a great deal of good work in raising the issues of the particular mandate that they were associated with. There were several special rapporteurs who resigned very early on in their mandates, but I was not privy to why they resigned or what issues they may have, difficult issues they may have encountered. So I'm not in a position really to want to talk about that, nor do I know anything really about the committee with respect to race and racism and what the issue was there. I do echo what Hillel said with respect to what are the dangers or risks. I mean, we're actually at home most of the time. This is a volunteer position. We keep our day job. My day job was as a law professor, and I had to continue all of my full-time teaching, all of my full-time research and writing in the areas that I did that on. I had 2 young kids, so I was home with my wife helping to raise them. So yes, I did do a fair amount of travel, certainly much more than my wife was happy about, but I was home most of the time. And keep in mind, as Hillel said, being a special rapporteur is a volunteer position and it's not paid at all. And with regards to the question of members of the Human Rights Council who are elected who happen to have poor human rights records, look, that's very true. But there's no country in the world that has an A++ rating with respect to domestic human rights. All of them engage in some kind of hypocrisy being there, some worse than others. It is a shame if you see a country with a pretty appalling human rights record who makes it to the Human Rights Council. And the only, I guess, the rainbow that you could say in all of that is that if a country with a poor human rights record makes it to the Human Rights Council, it generally means they have to pay attention to beginning to address their own human rights shortcomings, because they are going to be facing withering criticism for the 3 or 6 years they're on the council for having got there with their appalling human rights record. And it generally means that they will pay more attention to ensuring that they have human rights laws that actually can be enforced, that they are beginning to rethink how they imprison critics of their regime, or how poorly their democratic practices are, and whether or not they have to wind up addressing those. So there's a positive to being elected to the Human Rights Council, even with the worst of offenders, with regards to that. And the other thing is, a lot of bad offenders who put their names out to be elected don't get elected to the Human Rights Council precisely because they have poor human rights records and they don't have enough influence or money to be able to sway votes to get them elected. The fact that most countries see it as a step of prestige or an enhancement of their international reputation to be elected to the Human Rights Council says something quite positive, I think. And it helps, I think, and for the most part, trying to weed out those with less bad records and those with worse records who get on there. That's not a perfect answer, but then again, this is not really a perfect world either.
So maybe I can just add a couple of points. First of all, on the Human Rights Council, you may remember that the US was voted off of the Human Rights Council as well. I believe that was 2019. And I think it was off for at least a year or 2 before it was voted back on. So that is certainly a possibility. In terms of putting more pressure on the United States for its support of Israel. In terms of the CERD early warning system, that's a mechanism that CERD has put in place for civil society, for NGOs to file complaints when, in order to prevent apartheid or genocide. And Palestine actually has filed a complaint in the CERD under the early warning mechanism. And I don't believe that there has been a decision yet on that, but that submission was made well before last October. And it was on the issue of actually apartheid, based on the 10 reports or so that have been now the 10 NGO reports and the UN reports on apartheid. And the third is that one shouldn't rely on the International Criminal Court or the universal mechanisms to deliver on enforcement against impunity. What I believe the cases at the ICJ are showing us is the legal foundations for now civil society to take to their own governments, to pressure their own governments to take a range of measures available to all countries to sever relations with Israel, to sever economic ties, to stop providing visas to settlers, for example. There are such a wide range of available mechanisms that countries themselves can trigger, but that's up to national civil society members to pressure their states. In addition, there is this very powerful mechanism in many, particularly Western states, of universal jurisdiction. And that is something that private lawyers can trigger in some states by putting evidence and requesting investigations by their attorney generals and their ministries of the interior and their advocates general to issue warrants for the arrest of individuals who are the masterminds of the genocide that we are seeing now. So civil society is not powerless. I think the movement is now in our hands. And what is so useful about these decisions, including the provisional measures from the ICJ, what's so useful from them is that we have these legal platforms to then build on and make the arguments to our states about what they need to do. And by our states, I'm accepting the United States, although we have the wonderful Maria LaHood, I think she's on our amongst our participants today, who was one of the lead lawyers in the case in the district court in San Francisco against the U.S. Administration for complicity with genocide. So I think the ball is in our court.
Thank you so much for that, all of you. There's another question that I think Susan may have partially answered with your last comments, and that is, does the failure of international law to prevent the further slaughter in Gaza prove that international law is futile? And doesn't this leave people to engage in, quote, rebellion against tyranny as a last resort, unquote, as predicted in the preamble to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Anybody want to comment on that? And I do want to say one thing, and that is that under international law, people under occupation who are colonized, who live under a system of apartheid, have a lawful can lawfully resist occupation, colonization, apartheid through any means, including armed struggle. That's something I think people need to know.
Let me try to briefly answer the question, Marjorie, that you posed from the audience member. But before I do that, just let me slightly correct Susan. The U.S. wasn't voted off the Human Rights Council in 2018. That was under the Trump administration. It withdrew. It said that the Human Rights Council was a cesspool of political bias and was picking on Israel. And therefore, it withdrew from that. It also withdrew, I think, from UNESCO and several other important UN agencies. And I think it wound up being reelected back to the Human Rights Council under the Biden administration in 2021. With respect to international law, it's very easy to be cynical with respect to the efficacy of international law when one sees how often it winds up being disobeyed, disregarded, sidelined. And certainly when it comes to the question of the Middle East, it's been said, and I think probably quite rightly, that in the Middle East, international law is much closer to power than it is to justice. But that is that is to me an insufficient argument for why we should disregard or throw out or not pay attention to international law. International law, particularly international human rights law, international humanitarian law, international criminal law, are these person-made rules that, you know, in a world that's divided by race, class, religion, gender, caste, here we have something that has been human-made that winds up, I think, speaking to our very highest aspirations with respect to wanting to live in equality and dignity by the rule of law rather than the rule by law, with all of our human rights and our inherent humanness wind up being protected and enhanced. That's what's represented in the very best of international law. And of course, there are many countries who either don't regard it, don't want to obey it because it's not in their interest, and more likely because they can get away with it. And this is the case with respect to Israel. Israel has paid exceptionally little cost, politically or legally, for running a 57-year-old occupation that is now metastasized into apartheid. And it can do that because of the overwhelming support it winds up getting from the United States. But that is no reason to say, what's the use of international law? International law, first of all, is not meant for lawyers. It is meant for all of us. And it winds up being an extraordinarily powerful campaign tool to be able to say, with backing, with substance, with an anchor in facts and law, that this occupation is illegal, or this occupation has become apartheid, or this occupation is committing vast human rights violations that are being documented by a well-respected source, i.e. the United Nations, or by well-respected international human rights organizations anchored in law, is a tremendous asset to have in any of your advocacy, particularly if you're not a lawyer. So I think our ability to be able to raise these issues and say this is illegal, everybody will stop and pay attention when you say something is against the law, and you actually have sources and reports that back up what you're saying. That's an extraordinary ally to have on your side. And this is one of the great things, amid all this darkness and horror with respect to Palestine and with respect to Gaza, is that we have the law on our side. And when you have the law on your side, I mean, however bad the news is each morning when I wake up and look at my phone and look at my newspapers, what next ghastly thing has happened in Gaza, I still feel I make it through the day because I know that international law is on the side of Palestinian rights and Palestinian self-determination. I know that international law is and international justice is on the arc of history is bending towards justice on that. So all of this, I think, is important. And it's not. I don't think we should be starry-eyed about international law because our courts and our political tribunals wind up failing us time and again with regards to this. So if you go into relying upon or working with international law with a clear conception of what the limits of law are, and with a clear conception of what the limits of international politics are, that I think you're going to be less set up for disappointment and more set up for having that determination and grit to stay in this for the long run.
And that's exactly why we need the People's Academy of International Law. Thank you so much, Michael and Hilal and Susan, for a fascinating and informative course. And thank you all for attending. Our next course, 3B, will be on Thursday, May 2nd, and it will cover monitoring and implementation of treaties. So we hope to see you all back for course 3B. Thank you again to everyone, to Charlotte Cates, to our interpreters, to our wonderful faculty, and everyone who registered and attended this program, and everyone who will watch it online, even if they didn't attend this in person. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Marjorie. It was good. Thank you.
Thank you very much.